This is a reading of 4 essays of Rudolf Steiner entitled The Stages of Higher Knowledge, Imagination, Inspiration, Intuition. This is essay number 1, entitled The Stages of Higher Knowledge. In my book, titled How to Know Higher Worlds, the path to higher knowledge has been traced up to the meeting with the 2 guardians of the threshold. The relation in which the soul stands to the different worlds as it passes through the successive stages of knowledge will now be described. What will be given may be called, quote, the teachings of esoteric science, close quote. Before you enter the path of higher knowledge, you know only the first of 4 stages of cognition. This stage is the one you occupy in ordinary life in the world of the senses. Even in what is called science, we deal only with this first stage of knowledge. For science merely elaborates ordinary cognition more minutely and in a disciplined way. Aided by instruments, the microscope, the telescope, and so forth, the senses examine their surroundings with greater exactness than they could without these aids. Yet people remain at the same stage of cognition, whether they see large things with the naked eye or observe small objects and phenomena with the aid of a microscope. Also, in the application of thinking to facts and things, this science remains in the realm of everyday life. People arrange objects, describe and compare them, try to imagine their variations, and so forth. The keenest scientists do nothing fundamentally in this respect, but develop to a fine art the methods of observing everyday life. Their knowledge embraces a wider range, becomes more complex and more logical, but they do not proceed to another mode of cognition. In esoteric science, this first stage of knowledge is called the, quote, material mode of cognition, close quote. This is followed by 3 higher stages, and there are still others beyond these. These stages of knowledge shall be described here before proceeding with the description of the, quote, path of knowledge, close quote. Considering the ordinary method of scientific cognition, of apprehension through the senses as the first stage, we shall differentiate the following 4 stages. Number 1, material knowledge. Number 2, imaginative knowledge. Number 3, inspirational knowledge, parenthesis, which may also be called, quote, of the nature of will, close quote, parenthesis close. And number 4, intuitive knowledge. These stages will be discussed here. It must first be made quite clear what is significant in these different modes of cognition. In ordinary sensory knowledge, 4 elements are to be considered. Number 1, the object, which makes an impression upon the senses. Number 2, the image, which the human being forms of this object. Number 3, the concept, through which the human being arrives at a spiritual comprehension of an object or an event. 4, the capital I, which forms for itself the image and concept based on the impression of the object. Before people make for themselves an image or representation, an object is there that causes it. We do not form the object, but perceive it. And on the basis of the object, the image arises. As long as we are looking at an object, we are dealing with the thing itself. The moment we turn away from it, we are left with only the image. The object is relinquished, the image is retained in the memory. But one cannot stop here at the image-making stage. One must go on to concepts. The distinction between image and concept is absolutely necessary if we are to be clear at this point. Suppose one sees an object of circular form. Then one turns away and retains the picture of the circle in memory. So far, one has not yet the concept of the circle. We attain this concept only when we say to ourselves, Quote, "A circle is a figure in which all points are equidistant from the center." Close quote. Understanding of a thing is attained only when we have formed a concept of it. There are all kinds of circles, small, large, red, blue, and so forth. But there is only one concept circle. All these things will be approached more closely. For the moment, it will suffice to sketch what is necessary to characterize the first four stages of knowledge. The fourth element to consider in material cognition is the I, in which a union of images and concepts is produced. The I stores the image in memory. Otherwise, a continuing inner life would be impossible. Images of things would remain only so long as the things themselves affected the soul. But the inner life depends on linking one perception with another. The I directs itself to the world today because in the presence of certain objects, images from yesterday of similar objects arise. It is obvious that soul life would be impossible if the image of a thing could be held only as long as the thing itself was present. In relation to concepts also, the I forms the unity. It combines its concepts and so makes a survey, evokes an understanding of the world. This linking of concepts is what occurs in, quote, "forming judgments," close quote. A being having only loosely connected concepts would not find a way in the world. All human activity depends on our capacity to combine concepts, that is, to form judgments. The material mode of cognition rests on the fact that human beings receive impressions through the senses of things and representations of the outer world. We have the power of sensing, or sensibility. The impression received from outside is also called sensation. Therefore, in material cognition, four elements have to be considered: sensation, image, concept, and capital I. At the next higher stage of knowledge, the impression made upon the outer senses, the sensation, falls away. There is no longer any outer sensory object. Of the elements to which we are accustomed in ordinary knowledge, there remains only the three: image, concept, and I. Ordinary knowledge in a healthy individual does not create an image or concept unless an object confronts the outer senses. The I then remains inactive. Anyone who forms images for which the corresponding sensory objects do not actually exist lives in fantasy. But esoteric students acquire this very faculty of forming images without the stimulus of external sensory objects. With them, something else must take the place of outer objects. They must be able to form images, although no object touches their senses. Something must step in to replace sensation. This something is imagination. At this stage, images appear to the esoteric student in exactly the same way as if a sensory object were making an impression. They are as vivid and true as sensory images, yet they are not of material but of soul-spirit origin. Yet the senses remain entirely inactive. It is evident that individuals must first acquire this faculty of forming meaningful images without sense impressions. This is accomplished through meditation and through the exercises that have been described in the book titled How to Know Higher Worlds. Those who are confined to the sensory world live only among images that have reached them through the senses. Those who are imaginative have a world of images received from a higher source. Careful training is needed to distinguish illusion from reality in this higher image world. When such images first enter our soul, we tend to say, that's just fancy, a mere product of my thought life. This is quite understandable, for people today are accustomed to calling real only what is given on the certain basis of sensory evidence with no effort on their part. They must first become accustomed to accepting things that originate from a different side as real. In this respect, we cannot guard too carefully against becoming visionaries. The capacity to determine what is real and what is illusionary in these higher regions comes only from experience, and such experience must become our own in a quiet, patient inner life. We must be fully prepared to expect the tricks that illusion plays upon us. Everywhere the possibility lurks that images will emerge from delusions of the outer senses or of abnormal life. All such possibility must first be done away with. One must first completely close off the sources of fantasy. Only thus can one come to imagination. At this point, it will be clear that the world that one has entered in this way is not only just as real as the world of sense, but much more real. At the third stage of knowledge, images no longer appear. We now have to deal only with concept and I. Whereas, at the second stage, a world of images still surrounds us, a reminder from the moment when a vivid memory instantaneously generated impressions from the outer world without our actually having had such impressions. At the third stage, such images are no longer present. We live wholly in a purely spiritual world. Those accustomed to holding strictly to the senses will be tempted to believe that this world is pale and ghostly, but that is not at all the case. Nothing about the world of images at the second stage is pale or shadowy, unlike the images that remain in memory after the outer objects are no longer present. However, the pictures of imagination have vivacity and comprehensiveness that do not compare to the shadowy memory pictures of the sensory world, even those of the glittering and ephemeral physical world itself. Yet, this too is only a shadow compared to the realm of imagination. Now, the world of the third stage of knowledge. Nothing in the sensory world can even suggest its wealth and abundance. What was sensation at the first stage of cognition, imagination at the second, here becomes inspiration. Inspiration gives the impressions, and the I forms the concepts. If anything in the sensory realm can be compared with this world of inspiration, it is the world of tone, opened to us by our sense of hearing. Here, however, we are not dealing with the tones of earthly music, but purely spiritual tones. One begins to hear, in quotes, what is going on at the heart of things. The stone, the plant, and so on become spiritual words. The world begins to express its true nature to the soul. It sounds strange, but it is actually true that at this stage of knowledge we, quote, hear spiritually the grass growing, close quote. A crystal form is perceived as sound. An opening blossom speaks to us. Those who are inspired can proclaim the inner nature of things. Everything rises before the soul, as though from the dead, in a new kind of way. They speak a language that stems from another world, and that alone can make the everyday world comprehensible. Finally, at the fourth stage of knowledge, inspiration also ceases. Of the elements customarily observed in everyday knowledge, the I alone remains to be considered. The attainment of this stage by the esoteric student is marked by a definite inner experience. This experience manifests in the feeling that we no longer stand outside the things and events that we recognize, but within them. The image is not the object, but merely its imprint. Neither does inspiration yield the object itself, but only tells of it. But what now lives in the soul is in reality the object itself. The I has flowed forth over all beings. It has merged with them. The actual living of things within the soul is intuition. When it is said of intuition that, quote, through it we slip gradually into all things, close quote, this is literally true. In ordinary life, we have only one intuition, namely that of the I itself, for the I can in no way be perceived externally. It can be experienced only in the inner life. A simple consideration will make this fact clear. It is a consideration that has not been applied by psychologists with sufficient exactitude. Unimpressive as it may seem to one with full understanding, it is of the most far-reaching significance. It is as follows. A thing in the outer world can be called by all of us by the same name. A table can be spoken of by all as a table, a tulip by all as a tulip. Mr. Miller can be addressed by all as Mr. Miller. But there is one word that each of us can apply only to ourselves. This is the word I. No other person can call me I. To anyone else I am you. Likewise, everyone else is you to me. Only I can say I to myself. This is because each person lives not outside, but within the I. Similarly, in intuitive cognition, one lives in all things. The perception of the I is the prototype of all intuitive cognition. Thus, to enter all things, one must first step outside the self. We must become selfless in order to blend with the self or I of another being. Meditation and concentration are the sure means by which to approach this stage of cognition, like the earlier ones. Of course, they must be practiced in a quiet and patient way. Those who presume that they can violently or forcefully rise to higher worlds are mistaken. Giving ourselves over to such beliefs would be expecting the realities of the higher worlds to meet us as do phenomena of the sensory world. The worlds to which we may rise are rich and vivid, yet they are also delicate and subtle, whereas the sensory world is coarse and crude. The most important thing to be learned is that we must accustom ourselves to regard as real something wholly different from what is so designated in the realm of the senses. This is not easy. It is for this reason that so many who might willingly tread the esoteric path are frightened away at the first steps. One had expected to encounter things like tables and chairs, and instead finds spirits. But since spirits are not like chairs and tables, they seem like illusions. The only thing wrong is the unusualness. One must first acquire the right feeling for the spiritual world. Then one will not only see, but also acknowledge what is spiritual. A large part of esoteric training is concerned with this right acknowledgement and assessment of the spiritual. The state of sleep must first be considered if we are to arrive at any understanding of imaginative cognition. As long as we have attained no higher stage than material cognition, the soul truly lives during sleep, but is incapable of perception in the world in which it dwells while asleep. In this world it is like the blind among material objects. Such a one lives in the world of light and color, but does not perceive them. From the outer sensory organs, the eye, the ear, the ordinary brain activity, and so forth, the soul has withdrawn in sleep. It receives no impressions through the senses. Now, what is it doing during sleep? It must be realized that in waking life the soul is continually active. It takes in the outer sense impressions and works upon them. That is its activity. It stops this during sleep, but it is not idle. While sleeping, it works upon its own body. This body is worn out by the activity of the day. This expresses itself in fatigue. During sleep, the soul occupies itself with its own body in order to prepare it for further work when it again awakens. We see from this how essential is proper sleep to bodily well-being. Accordingly, those who do not sleep sufficiently hinder their soul in this necessary repair work upon the body. The consequence must be that the body deteriorates. The forces with which the soul works upon the body during sleep are the same through which it is active in the waking state. But in the latter case, they are applied for absorbing the impressions of the outer senses and working upon them. Now, when imaginative cognition approaches in us, part of the forces directed upon the body in sleep must be employed in another way. Through these forces are formed the spiritual sense organs that provide the possibility for the soul not merely to live in a higher world, but also to perceive it. Thus the soul, during sleep, works no longer merely upon the body, but also upon itself. This work results from meditation and concentration, as well as from other exercises. It has often been stated in my writings about higher knowledge that the particular directions for such exercises are given only from one individual to another. No one should undertake such exercises independently, since only those who are experienced in this realm can assess the effect for one who withdraws one's soul work from the body and applies it in a higher way. Meditation, concentration, and other exercises lead the soul to withdraw for a time from its union with the sensory organs and to become immersed in itself. Its activity is turned inward. In the first stages of such self-immersion, the soul's inner activity differs but little from its ordinary inclinations. In its inner labors, it must use the thoughts, feelings, and sensations that belong to ordinary life. As the soul becomes accustomed to being somewhat blind and deaf to the material environment and to living within itself, it gains capacity for inner accomplishments. Accomplishments through immersion in the inner life bear fruit first in the sleeping state. At night, when the soul is freed from the body, what was stimulated in it by the day's exercises works on. Organs take shape within it, through which it connects with a higher reality, exactly as it had through the outer sense organs with the physical world. Out of the darkness of nocturnal surroundings appear the light phenomena of the higher world. Tender and intimate at first is this communion. It must be taken into account in this connection that for a long time, upon awakening, the light of day will draw a dense veil over the night's experiences. The recollection that perception has occurred during the night appears slowly and gradually. It is not easy to learn how to pay attention to the delicate formations of one's soul, which, during one's development, begin to mingle with the common experiences of daily sensory life. At first, such formations of the soul resemble what are generally referred to as casual impressions. Everything depends on learning to distinguish what arises from the ordinary world from what, through its own nature, presents itself as a manifestation from higher worlds. In a quiet, introspective, mental life, we must acquire this discernment. It is necessary first to develop a sense of the value and meaning of those intimate formations of the soul that mingle with daily life, as though they were, quote, chance impressions, close quote, but are actually recollections of our nightly communion with a higher reality. However, they vanish as soon as we seize these things in a crude way and apply the measuring stick of sensory life to them. It is thus evident that, through work in a higher world, the soul must withdraw from the body some of its activity ordinarily bestowed upon it with such care. It leaves the body to a certain extent self-dependent, and the body needs a substitute for what the soul had formerly done for it. If it does not obtain such a substitute, it comes in danger of mischief from harmful forces. For one must in this regard be clear that we are continually subjected to the influences of our surroundings. Actually, we live only through the influences of these surroundings. Among these, the kingdoms of visible nature come under consideration first. We belong to this visible nature. We could not live if there were no mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms or other human beings around us. Imagine an individual being cut off from the earth and lifted into surrounding space. Such a person would perish instantly as a physical being, just as one's hand would wither if cut away from the body. Just as it would be a great illusion if a human hand believed it could exist without the body, equally great would be the illusion of those who maintain that they could exist as a physical being, without the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms, and without other people. In addition to these kingdoms, however, are three others that generally escape people's notice, the three elemental kingdoms. They exist, in a sense, below the mineral kingdom. Beings exist who do not condense into the mineral condition, but they are nonetheless present and influence human beings. Parenthesis. Further information on the elemental kingdoms can be found in my book titled Cosmic Memory, and in remarks about them in my title Theosophy. Close parenthesis. We are thus exposed to influences from kingdoms of nature that in a sense must be called invisible. When the soul works on the body, much of its activity involves regulating the influences of the elemental kingdoms so that they are beneficial to human beings. As soon as the soul withdraws part of its activity from the body, detrimental forces from the elemental kingdoms may take hold of it. This is a danger of higher development. Therefore, we must be careful that as soon as the soul is withdrawn from the body, the soul is accessible only to beneficial influences from the elemental world. If this is disregarded, the ordinary person deteriorates to a certain extent physically and morally, despite having gained access to higher worlds. While the soul dwells in the higher regions, pernicious forces insinuate themselves into the dense physical body and the etheric body. This is why certain bad qualities, which before higher development had been held in check by the regulating power of the soul, may now show themselves through lack of caution. When they enter higher worlds, people formerly of good moral character may under such circumstances reveal all kinds of low inclinations, increased selfishness, untruthfulness, vindictiveness, wrath, and so on. Those alarmed by this fact need not be deterred from rising to the higher worlds, but they must be careful to prevent such occurrences. Our lower human nature must be fortified and made inaccessible to dangerous elemental influences. This can be brought about by consciously cultivating certain virtues presented in writings on spiritual development. This is why they must be carefully sought. They are the following. First, we must, in a fully conscious way, in all things, focus continually on the permanent, First we must, in a fully conscious way, in all things, focus continually on the permanent, distinguishing the imperishable from the transitory, and turning our attention toward it. In all beings and phenomena, we can suppose or discern something that remains after the transitory appearance has faded away. If I see a plant, first I can observe it as it presents itself to the senses. No one should neglect to do this, for anyone who has not become thoroughly familiar with the perishable aspect will detect the eternal in phenomena. Okay, I'm going to discuss this sentence. I think there's a word missing. Let me read this sentence again, then I'm going to read it as I think it should be, but it can be corrected on this. Food for thought for anyone listening. No one should neglect to do this. That is, let me read that again. If I see a plant, first I can observe it as it presents itself to the senses. No one should neglect to do this, for anyone who has not become thoroughly familiar with the perishable aspect will detect the eternal in phenomena. I think that's incorrect. I think it should say, no one should neglect to do this, for anyone who has not become thoroughly familiar with the perishable aspect will not detect the eternal in phenomena. I think the word not is missing, but I don't know for sure. End of aside by the reader. Those who fear that fixing attention on the spiritually imperishable will cause them to lose the freshness and naturalness of life do not really understand the nature of this process. When I look at a plant in this way, it can become clear to me that within it is a lasting, living impulse that will reappear in a new plant when the present plant has long since crumbled to dust. We must adopt such an attitude in our whole approach to life. Second, the heart must be fixed upon all that is valuable and genuine, which we must learn to esteem more highly than the fleeting and insignificant. In all feelings and actions, the value of any single thing must be held before one's eyes in the context of the whole. Third, 6 qualities should be developed: control of the thought world, control of actions, endurance, impartiality, trust in the surrounding world, and inner equilibrium. Control of the thought world can be attained by combating the wandering, will-o'-the-wisp thoughts and feelings that constantly rise and fall in ordinary human beings. In everyday life, people are not the masters of their thoughts, but are driven by them. Naturally, this must be so, for life drives people, and as practical individuals, they must yield to this. In ordinary life, there is no alternative. To approach a higher reality, however, at least brief periods must be set aside, during which we become rulers of our thoughts and feelings. In complete inner freedom, we place a thought at the center of the soul, where ideas otherwise thrust themselves upon us from without. We try to keep all intruding thoughts and feeling away, and to link only what we will to admit as suitable with the first thought. Such an exercise works beneficially on the soul, and through the soul on the body. It brings the body into such an harmonious condition that it withdraws itself from harmful influences, despite the fact that the soul is not affecting it directly. Controls of actions similarly involves regulation of acts through inner freedom. A good beginning is to determine to do something regularly that one would not typically do in ordinary life, since people are indeed driven to their actions from without in normal life. However, the smallest action performed on one's innermost initiative accomplishes more toward self-development than do all the pressures of outer life. Endurance means holding ourselves at a distance from the whims that involve a shift from, quote, exulting to the highest heaven to grieving even unto death, close quote. People are driven to and fro through all kinds of moods. Pleasure brings gladness, pain brings depression. This has its justification, but those who seek the path to higher knowledge must be able to mitigate joy and grief. We must gain stability. We must surrender with moderation to both pleasurable impressions and painful experiences. We must move with dignity through both without being absent or disconcerted. This does not produce lack of feeling, but brings us to the steady center within the ebbing and flowing tides of life around us. We always have ourselves in control. Another important quality is positivity. This can be developed in those who in all things have an eye for the good, This can be developed in those who in all things have an eye for the good, beautiful, and purposeful aspects of life, and not primarily for the blameworthy, ugly, and contradictory. In Persian poetry there is a beautiful legend about Christ that illustrates the meaning of this quality. A dead dog is lying on the road. Among those who pass by is Christ. Everyone else turns away from the ugly sight. Only Christ pauses and speaks admiringly of the animal's beautiful teeth. It is possible to look at things in this way, and those who earnestly seek it may find in everything, even the most repulsive, something worthy of acknowledgement. The fruitfulness in things is not in what is lacking in them, but in what they have. It is also important to develop impartiality. We have all gone through our experiences, and from them have formed a fixed set of opinions through which we direct our lives. Just as conformity to experience is of course necessary, on the one hand, it is also important that those who would pass through spiritual development to higher knowledge always keep an eye open for everything new and unfamiliar that confronts them. They will be as cautious as possible with judgments such as, quote, that is impossible, close quote, or, quote, that cannot be, close quote. Whatever opinions may have been formed from previous experiences, they will be ready at any moment, when encountering something new, to allow a new opinion. Love for our own opinions must vanish. Once these 5 qualities have been acquired, the 6th presents itself as a matter of course: inner balance and harmony of spiritual forces. We must find a spiritual center of gravity within that gives us firmness and security in the face of all the phenomena that would otherwise pull us one way or another in life. We must not avoid full participation in surrounding life, and everything must be allowed to work on us. Fleeing the distractions of life is not the correct course, but rather a fully devoted surrender to life with the sure, firm guarding of inner balance and harmony. Finally, quote, will to freedom, close quote, must come within the seeker's consideration. Those who find within themselves the support and basis of all that they accomplish already have this attribute. This is hard to achieve because of the balance needed between opening the senses to everything great and good and a simultaneous rejection of every compulsion. It is easy to say that outer influence is incompatible with freedom. The essential thing is that the two be reconciled within the soul. When someone tells me something and I simply accept it under the compulsion of authority, I am not free. But I am equally unfree when I cut myself off from the good that I might receive in this way. In that case, worse elements in my soul act as a compulsion upon me. Freedom means not only that I am free from the compulsion of an outside authority, but above all, that I am also not subservient to my own prejudices, opinions, sensations, and feelings. The right way is not blind subjection to what is received, but to leave ourselves open to suggestion, receiving it impartially, so that we may freely acknowledge it. An outside authority should exert no more influence than to make one say, quote, "I make myself free just by following the good in it." That is to say, by making it my own, close quote. Authority, based on esoteric wisdom, will exert influence only in this way. It gives whatever it has to give, not to gain power over the recipient, but only to help the recipient become richer and freer through the gift. The significance of these qualities has already been touched on in the discussion of the lotus flowers in How to Know Higher Worlds. It showed their relationship to the development of the 12-petal lotus flower in the region of the heart and to the currents of the ether body connected with it. From what has been said, it is now evident that these qualities enable the seeker to dispense with those forces that formerly benefited the physical body during sleep, and which now, because of one's development, must be gradually withdrawn from this task. Imaginative knowledge develops under such influences. The end of essay number 1. This is a reading of a collection of essays by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Stages of Higher Knowledge, Imagination, Inspiration, Intuition. This is essay number 2, entitled Imagination. It is not possible to make real progress in penetrating higher realities without going through the stage of imaginative knowledge. This in no way implies that during esoteric training we are compelled to remain for a period at the imaginative stage, as though it were a class to be attended at school. In certain instances this may be necessary, but it is certainly not a general rule. It depends entirely upon what we as esoteric students have experienced before taking up esoteric training. It will be shown in this discussion that the spiritual environment of the esoteric student is important in this regard, and that depending on our orientation to this spiritual environment, diverse methods have been instituted for walking the path of knowledge. It can be of the utmost importance to know what follows if one is preparing to undergo esoteric training. Not merely as an interesting theory does this come into consideration, but as something by which manifold practical points of view can be gained if one is to succeed on the path to higher knowledge. It is often said by those striving toward a higher development, "I wish to become perfect spiritually. I wish to develop the higher self," in quotes, within me, but I have no desire for the manifestations of the astral world. This is understandable when one takes into consideration the descriptions of the astral world found in books dealing with such things. There, to be sure, appearances and beings are mentioned that bring all sorts of dangers to people. It will be said that under the influence of such beings, we may easily suffer harm to our moral disposition and mental health. It will be brought home to the reader that in these regions the wall dividing the good from the evil path is as a spider's web in thickness, and that the plunge into immeasurable abysses, the fall into utter depravity, lies all too near. It is of course impossible simply to contradict such assertions. Yet in many cases this view of walking the esoteric path is in no way correct. The only reasonable point of view is that no one should be deterred from traveling the way of higher knowledge because of dangers, but that in every case strict care must be taken to weather the dangers. It may happen that one who asks an esoteric teacher's guidance will be counseled to postpone actual training for a time, and first undergo certain experiences of ordinary life, or learn things that can be learned in the physical world. It will then be the task of the esoteric teacher to give the seeker the right instructions for accumulating such experiences and learning such things. In most cases, the esoteric teacher will be found to proceed in this way. If then you are sufficiently attentive to what happens to you after you have come into contact with the esoteric teacher, you will be able to observe many things. You will find that henceforth things happen to you as if, in quotes, by accident, and that you can observe things to which you would never have been exposed without a link with that esoteric teacher. If students do not notice this and become impatient, it is because they have not been attentive to what has happened to them. It should not be believed that the influence of the teacher upon the student will show itself in distinctly visible tricks of magic. Such influence is really an intimate matter, and those who would explore its nature and essence without having first reached a certain stage of esoteric training will surely err. Students injure themselves in every case in which they become impatient toward the prescribed waiting time. Their advance will be none the less rapid on this account. On the contrary, one's progress would be slowed down by beginning too soon the training for which one often impatiently awaits. If students allow the waiting time, or the other advice and hints from the esoteric teacher, to influence them correctly, they will actually prepare themselves to hold their ground in the face of certain trials and dangers that approach when they encounter the unavoidable stage of imagination. This stage is unavoidable because those who seek communication with the higher world, without having passed through it, can do so only unconsciously and are condemned to fumbling in the dark. We can acquire some faint sense of this higher world without imagination. Without it, we can certainly attain a sense of being united with, quote, one's God, close quote, or, quote, one's higher self, close quote. But we cannot come in this way to true knowledge in full consciousness and bright, luminous clarity. Therefore, all talk about coming to terms with the inferior spiritual worlds, parenthesis, the astral and the devaconic, close parenthesis, being unnecessary, or that the only thing necessary is to awaken the God within, in quotes, is no more than illusion. Those who are satisfied with this approach should not be interfered with in their efforts, and an esotericist would not interfere in this way. But true esotericism has nothing to do with such goals. It makes no demand upon anybody to become a student. In those who seek its discipline, however, it will not just awaken a dim perception of themselves as godlike, in quotes, but will try to open their spiritual eyes to the realities of higher worlds. Of course, the, in quotes, divine self is in everyone, in every created being. The divine self is also contained and active in stones, plants, and animals. It is not important to feel and know this in a general way, but rather to establish a living connection with the manifestations of the divine self. Just as we can mutter repeatedly that this world contains the divine self veiled within it, and yet know nothing of the physical world, likewise those who seek the divine kingdom of spirit only in vague and indeterminate generalities know nothing of higher worlds. We need to open our eyes and see the revelation of deity in the phenomena of the physical world, in a stone or a plant, and not merely dream away all these as mere appearances, with the true form of God somehow concealed, in quotes, behind them. No, God reveals himself in his creations, and those who would know God must first learn to know the true essence of these creations. Therefore, we must also learn to see what really goes on and what lives in the higher worlds if we wish to know the divine. The consciousness that the God-human dwells within us can at best offer a beginning. Experienced in the right way, however, such a beginning leads to an actual lift into the higher worlds. But this is possible only for those in whom the spiritual, in quotes, senses have been developed. Any other view leads only to the thought that one will remain as is, and attain only what is possible to attain in this way. However, the goal of the esotericist is to become a different human being in order to behold and experience things other than the customary ones. It is precisely for this purpose that passage through imaginative knowledge is necessary. It has already been said that this stage of imagination need not be conceived of as a school class that must be gone through. It is to be understood that particularly in present-day life, there are those who bring with them preconditions that enable an esoteric teacher to evoke in them inspired and intuitive knowledge simultaneously, or nearly so, with the imaginative. But it should in no way be understood that any person can be spared passage through the imaginative stage. The cause of danger inherent in imaginative knowledge has already been pointed out in my book titled How to Know Higher Worlds. The cause is that upon entry to that world, human beings in a certain sense lose the ground beneath their feet. The source of their security in the physical world is for the moment and to all appearances entirely lost. Upon perception of something in the physical world, it is asked, whence comes this perception? This is done mostly unconsciously, but it is quite unconsciously clear that the causes of the perception are objects, in quotes, outside in space. Colors, sounds, and odors radiate from these objects. Colors would not be seen floating free in space, nor sounds heard without consciousness arising as to the objects to which these colors pertain as qualities, and from which these tones arise. Awareness that objects and entities cause physical perceptions gives them, and thus also human beings, security and a sure hold. Those having perceptions without outer causes are seen as abnormal and pathological. Perceptions without causes are called illusions, hallucinations, and visions. Viewed only externally, the imaginative world consists wholly of such hallucinations, visions, and illusions. It has been pointed out in How to Know Higher Worlds that through esoteric training, visions and such are produced artificially. By focusing our consciousness on a seed or a dying plant, certain forms, which are nothing but hallucinations to begin with, are evoked before the soul. Observed outwardly, the quote, flame formation, close quote, parenthesis, appearing in the soul through observation of a plant or the like, and, after a while, separating itself completely from the plant, close parenthesis, is considered on the same level as an hallucination. It is the same in esoteric training when the imaginative world is entered. What was customarily regarded as going forth from things outside in space or clinging to them as properties, colors, sounds, odors, now float free in space. Perceptions break free from all outer things and swim free in space or fly around in it. Yet it is known with strict accuracy that the things before us have not produced those perceptions, but rather that they are self-induced by the human being. Similarly, one thinks that one has, quote, lost the ground beneath one's feet, close quote. In ordinary life, in the physical world, those inner images that do not proceed from things must be guarded against and are without ground or foundation. But to evoke imaginative knowledge, the prime essential is to have colors, sounds, odors, etc., fully torn loose from all things and floating free in space. The next step toward imaginative knowledge is to find a new, quote, ground and foundation, close quote, for the imaginations that are thus adrift. This must occur in that other world that is now about to be revealed. new things and entities take possession of these inner imaginations. In the physical world, for instance, the color blue stays on a cornflower. In the imaginative world, likewise, it must not remain free-floating. It flows, as it were, towards some being, and whereas it floated unattached at first, it now becomes the expression of a being. Something speaks through it that the observer can perceive only in the imaginative world. And so these free-floating imaginations gather around definite centers. It becomes clear that beings are speaking to us through them. And as in the physical world there are corporeal things and beings to which colors, sounds, odors, and so forth are attached, or from which they are derived, so now spiritual beings speak out through them. These spiritual beings are in fact always present. They hover continually around human beings, but cannot reveal themselves to them without an opportunity to do so. They are given this possibility when we manifest the capacity to let sounds, colors, and such arise before our soul, even when not caused by a physical object. Spiritual facts and beings are entirely different from objects and entities of the physical world. In ordinary speech, it is not easy to find an expression that even remotely describes the distinction. Perhaps the best approach is to say that in the imaginative world, everything speaks to us as if it were directly intelligent, whereas in the physical world, intelligence can reveal itself only in a roundabout way, through physicality. This allows flexibility and freedom in the imaginative world. The medium of the outer object is absent, and the spiritual lives itself out with full immediacy in the free-floating tones, colors, and so on. Now the basis of danger threatening human beings in this world lies in the fact that they perceive the manifestations of spiritual beings, but not the beings themselves. This is the case as long as we remain only in the imaginative world and rise no higher. Only inspiration and intuition lead us gradually to the beings themselves. If, however, the esoteric teacher should awaken these faculties prematurely, without having thoroughly introduced a student to the realm of imagination, the higher world would reveal only a shadowy and phantom-like existence. The whole glorious fullness of the pictures in which it reveals itself, when one really enters into it, would be lost. Herein lies the reason why the esoteric student needs a guide, in quotes. For esoteric students, the imaginative world is at first only a, quote, picture world, close quote, of which, mostly, they do not know the meaning. But the esoteric teacher knows to what things and entities these pictures pertain in a still higher world. If students have confidence in the teacher, they can know that later connections will be revealed, which they cannot yet penetrate. In the physical world, the objects in space were themselves their guides. They were able to prove the accuracy of their inner pictures of them. Physical reality is the rock upon which all hallucinations and illusions must be shattered. This rock disappears into an abyss when the imaginative world is entered. Therefore the teacher must serve as another such rock. From what the teacher can offer, students must sense the reality of the new world. From this it can be judged what great confidence in the teacher must exist in any esoteric training worthy of the name. When one can no longer believe in the teacher, it is exactly the same in this higher world as if in the physical world everything on which faith in the reality of one's perceptions had been built were suddenly taken away. Apart from this fact, there is yet another that might throw us into confusion if we were to enter the imaginative world without guidance. And as esoteric students, we must first learn to know ourself as distinct from all other spiritual beings. In physical life, we have feelings, desires, longings, passions, ideas, and so forth. Of course, these are all caused by things and beings of the outer world. But we know quite well that they form our inner world, and we distinguish them from the objects of the outer world as events within the soul. But as soon as the imaginative sense is awakened, this ease of differentiation ceases completely. Our feelings, ideas, passions, and so on literally step outside of us and assume form, color, and tone. We stand before them now as we do before wholly strange objects and beings in the physical world. It will be understood that such confusion can become complete when we recall what was said in the chapter titled, quote, "Some Results of Initiation," close quote, entitled How to Know Higher Worlds. It describes the way that the imaginative world appears to the observer. All appears reversed, as in a reflection. What flows from us seems as though it were coming toward us from outside. A wish that we cherish changes into a form, say that of some fantastic-looking animal or an entity resembling a human being. It appears to attack us or cause us to do one thing or another. Thus it can happen that we appear to ourselves as surrounded by a wholly fantastic, often charming and seductive or horrible world of fluttering forms. In reality, these are simply our thoughts, wishes, and passions transformed into images. It would be a great error to believe it easy to distinguish between this self transformed into images on the one hand and the real spiritual world on the other. At first, it is downright impossible for a student to make this distinction. An identical picture can come from some spiritual being that speaks to us or from something in the interior of the soul. And if our development is unduly precipitate at this point, there is danger of never learning to separate the two in an orderly fashion. The greatest caution is the rule in this regard. Now the confusion will be still greater, in that the soul's wishes and desires clothe themselves in images of an opposite character from what they really are. It may be assumed, for instance, that vanity clothes itself in a picture in this way. It may appear as a charming shape, promising wonderful things if its demands are met. Its pronouncements seem to set goals thoroughly good and worthy. When followed, however, they plunge one into moral and other kinds of ruin. Conversely, a good soul quality can clothe itself in unpleasant garb. At this point, only a true knower can differentiate, and only one who is not susceptible to weakening in the correct goal remains steady in face of the seductive artifices of the soul's imagery. From these considerations, one will recognize a need for the guidance of a teacher who, with a sure sense, makes the student attentive to what is fantasy and what is true in this realm. There is no need to believe that a teacher must always stand just behind the student. The presence of the teacher close to the esoteric student in space is not what matters most. Certainly there is the moment when such spatial presence is desirable, and also when it is absolutely necessary. On the other hand, the esoteric teacher finds means of remaining in touch with the student, even when physically far removed. Moreover, it must be observed that much of what takes place between teacher and student in this sphere, when they meet, can go on working often for months and perhaps for years afterward. But there is one thing that must surely destroy the necessary link between teacher and student. This happens if the student loses confidence in the teacher. It is especially bad when this bond of confidence has been broken before the student has learned to distinguish the illusory reflections of one's soul from reality. Now, it could be argued at this point that if a connection with the teacher occurs in this way, The esoteric student loses all freedom and independence. We give ourselves, so to speak, wholly into the hands of the teacher. This is in truth, however, not at all the case. The various methods of esoteric training certainly differ from one another with respect to dependence upon the teacher. Such dependence can be required to a greater or a lesser degree, and it is greatest in the methods that were followed by Eastern esotericists, who even today teach it as their own. This dependence is less in so-called Christian initiation, and strictly speaking, its complete omission comes on the path of knowledge that since the 14th century has come to be advanced by the so-called Rosicrucian esoteric schools. On this path, the teacher can in no way be disregarded. That is impossible. But all dependence on the teacher ceases. How this is possible will be presented in the continuation of these thoughts, when we shall explain precisely how these three paths of knowledge differ: the Eastern, the Christian, and the Rosicrucian. In the Rosicrucian approach, there is nothing at all upsetting in any way to a modern person's sense of freedom. It will also be described in this continuation how one person or another as an esoteric student, even in contemporary Europe, may travel not the Rosicrucian, but the Eastern path, or the Old Christian, although today the Rosicrucian is the most natural. This way, as will be seen in due course, is not at all unchristian. We can go this way without endangering our Christianity, as can also those who suppose themselves to stand at the pinnacle of the modern scientific worldview. But perhaps another explanation is needed. One might feel tempted to ask whether esoteric students could not be spared going through the delusions of their own soul. But if this happened, they would never attain that independent discernment so desirable for them. By no other means can the singular nature of the imaginative world be so well grasped as by the soul's observation. To begin with, we know the inner life of our soul from one side. We are immersed in it, and this is just what the esoteric student has to learn. Not only to look at things from outside, but also to observe them as if we ourselves were within all of them. If our own thought world now meets us as something foreign, and we already know something from one perspective, we can still come to know it from another. We must ourselves become, to a certain degree, the first example of such knowledge. Here in the physical world we are accustomed to something quite different. Here we view all other things only from outside, but we experience ourselves only from the inside. As long as we remain in the physical world, we can never see behind the surface of things. We can never go outside ourselves, quote, slip out of our skin, close quote, as it were, to observe ourselves from outside. This objective observation of ourself is literally our first obligation in esoteric training. This helps us learn to look as well beneath the surface of outer facts and beings. The end of essay number 2. This is a reading of a collection of 4 essays by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Stages of Higher Knowledge. This is essay number 3, entitled Inspiration. It becomes evident from the description of imagination that through it esoteric students leave the ground of outer sensory experiences. This is even more the case for inspiration. Here, representation, in parentheses image forming, is based much less on what can be designated as outer stimulus. We must find strength within ourselves to make it possible for us to form representations of things. We must be active inwardly on a much higher level than in the case of outer cognition, when we simply give ourselves over to outer impressions which cause the images. This kind of surrender ceases when we come to inspiration. The eye, EYE, no longer supplies colors, no ear supplies sounds, and so forth. The whole content of representations must be shaped largely by one's own activity, consequently by purely spirit-soul processes. And the manifestation of the higher world must be impressed upon what we have created by this inner activity. A peculiar contradiction seems to appear in such a description of the world of higher cognition. As individuals, we should, to a certain extent, be the creator of our own representations. Yet, of course, such representations must not be allowed to be our own creation. The processes of the higher world must be expressed through them, just as the processes of the lower world are expressed through the perceptions of the eyes, ears, and such. But contradiction is inevitable when describing this mode of cognition, for this is exactly what esoteric students must claim on the path of inspiration. Through inner activity, they must attain a result that is compelled outwardly in ordinary life. Why do the images representing the outer world in ordinary life not take an arbitrary course? Because we have to make our inner imagery conform to the outer objects. All arbitrariness of the I, capital I, falls away because the phenomena say what they are. Objects themselves tell us how to think of them. It is not up to the I, capital. Those who will not adjust themselves to the objects have erroneous thoughts, and quickly become aware of how little success they have with the world's phenomena. This necessary human attitude toward the things of the outer world can be designated in cognition by the term selfless. We must become selfless toward phenomena, and the outer world becomes our teacher in that selflessness. It removes from us all illusions, all fantastic notions, all illogical judgments, all non-objectivity, simply by putting the correct image before our senses. If we wish to prepare for inspiration, we must develop our inner nature so that this selflessness becomes our very own, even when nothing outside compels it. We must learn to create inwardly, but in such a way that our I, capital, does not in the least way play an arbitrary role in this creative activity. The difficulties to be considered in achieving such selflessness become the more apparent the more consideration is given to what soul powers are especially needed for inspiration. The three fundamental powers of soul life are differentiated: representation, in parentheses thinking, feeling, and willing. In everyday sensory cognition, representations are stimulated into existence by outer objects, and through these externally stimulated representations, the directions taken by feeling and willing are determined. For instance, we see an object. It gives us pleasure, and as a result we desire the thing. Pleasure is rooted in feeling, and through feeling the will is aroused, just as feeling has itself received its stamp from thinking. But the ultimate foundation of thinking, feeling, and willing is the external object. Another example might be a man who witnesses an event. It frightens him. He runs away from the scene of the event. Here, too, the outer occurrences are the initial cause. They are perceived through the senses, become representations, the feeling of fear springs up, and the will, expressing itself as running away, is the result. In inspiration, any outer object of this kind falls away. The senses do not come into play for a perception. Therefore they cannot give rise to representations. From this side, no influence is exerted upon feeling and willing. Yet it is precisely from these two, as out of a mother substance, that representations for inspiration arise and grow inwardly. If the mother substance is healthy, true representations will arise. If unhealthy, errors and illusions. As certainly as inspirations that originate in healthy feeling and willing can be revelations from a higher world, so certainly do errors, delusions, and fantastic notions concerning a higher world spring from confused feeling and willing. Esoteric training, therefore, undertakes to indicate how we may make our feelings and will impulses productive in a healthy way for inspiration. As in all matters of esoteric training, the need here is for an intimate regulating and forming of soul life. First of all, certain feelings must be developed that are known only to a slight degree in ordinary life. Some of these feelings will be hinted at here. Among the most important is a heightened sensitivity to truth and falsehood, to right and wrong. Certainly the ordinary human being has similar feelings, but they must be developed by the esoteric student in a much higher measure. Suppose someone has made a logical error. Another sees this mistake and corrects it. Let it be clear how great the role of judgment and intellect in such a correction is, and how slight the feeling of pleasure in the right and displeasure in the wrong. Surely this is not to say that the pleasure and corresponding displeasure are non-existent, but the degree to which they are present in ordinary life must be raised immeasurably for esoteric training. Esoteric students must turn their attention most systematically to their soul life, and they must make sure that logical error is a source of pain to them, no less excruciating than physical pain, and conversely that the right gives them true joy and delight. Thus, where another only stirs the intellect or power of judgment into motion, esoteric students must learn to live through the whole gamut of emotions, from grief to enthusiasm, from afflictive tension to transports of delight in the possession of truth. In fact, they must learn to feel something like hatred against what a normal person experiences only in a cold and sober way as incorrect. They must enkindle within a love of truth that has a personal character, as personal and as warm as a lover feels toward the beloved. Certainly much is said in our cultured circles about the love of truth. Yet what this means cannot be compared with what esoteric students must go through in quiet, inner soul work toward this end. As a result, they must patiently and repeatedly place before themselves some true thing or some false one, and devote themselves to it, not merely to train their power of judgment for sober discrimination between true and false, but to gain a personal relationship to it all. It is absolutely correct that in the beginning of such training we can become overly sensitive. An erroneous judgment that we overhear, an inconsistency, and so on, can cause almost unbearable pain. Care must thus be taken in this respect during training, otherwise great dangers might indeed result for our soul's equilibrium. If we are careful to maintain a steadfast character, storms may occur in the soul life, and we still retain the power to conduct ourselves toward the outer world with harmonious countenance and bearing. It is a mistake in every case when esoteric students are brought into opposition to the outer world so that they find it unbearable or want to flee from it entirely. The higher world of feeling must not be cultivated at the expense of well-balanced activity and work in the outer world. Therefore, a strengthening of the power to withstand outer impressions must appear in corresponding measure to the inner lifting of the feeling life. Practical esoteric training, therefore, directs us never to undertake the previously mentioned exercises for developing the feeling world without at the same time developing ourselves toward an appreciation of the tolerance that life demands of us. We must be able to feel the keenest pain when someone offers an erroneous opinion, and yet at the same time be perfectly accepting of such a one, because the thought in our mind is equally clear that the person is bound to judge in this way, and that the opinion must be dealt with as a fact. It is correct, of course, that the inner being of the esoteric scientist will be transformed increasingly into a twofold life. Ever richer processes occur in the soul during our pilgrimage through life, and a second world continually gains more independence from what the outer world offers. It is this twofold existence that will bear fruit in the genuine practice of life. What results from it is quick-witted judgment and unerring certainty of decision, while those who stand remote from such training must go through long trains of thought, driven hither and thither between resolution and perplexity. The esoteric scientist will swiftly survey life situations and discern hidden relations concealed from the ordinary view. One, then, often needs much patience to synchronize with the slow rate at which another person is able to grasp something that comes swift as an arrow for oneself. Thus far, we have spoken only of the qualities that must be developed in the feeling life, so that inspiration can occur correctly. The next question is this: how do the feelings become fruitful so that they are represented accurately for the world of inspiration? If we wish to understand what esoteric science offers in answer to this question, we must become acquainted with the fact that our soul life always has a certain treasure of feeling over and above those stimulated by sensory perceptions. We feel, as it were, far more than things compel us to feel, but in ordinary life this excess is employed in a direction that through esoteric training must be transformed into another. Take, for instance, a feeling of anxiety or fear. It can be crystal clear that fear or anxiety is often greater than it would be if it were in true proportion to the corresponding outer event. Imagine that as esoteric students we are working energetically on ourselves with the aim to feel in no instance more fear and anxiety than is justified by the corresponding external events. Now, a given amount of fear or anxiety always entails an expenditure of soul force. This soul force is actually lost as a result when fear or anxiety is produced. We really conserve this soul force when we deny ourselves fear or anxiety or other such feelings, and it remains at our disposal for another purpose. If we repeat such processes often, we build up an inner treasure of these continually cultivated soul forces, and we soon find that out of such economies of feeling arise the seeds of the inner images that express the revelations of a higher life. Such matters cannot be proved in the ordinary sense. Esoteric students can only be advised to do this or that, and if we do so, to watch for the indubitable results. A careless examination of what has been described might easily make it seem a contradiction to demand from the one side an enrichment of the feeling world with feelings of pleasure or pain to be kindled by what otherwise arouses only intellectual judgment, and from the other side to speak in almost the same breath of an economy of feeling. This contradiction quickly disappears when we recall that the economies are to be effected in the feelings aroused by the physical senses. Just what is conserved here appears conversely as an enrichment of spiritual experience. And it is wholly correct that the feelings conserved in this way in the world of sensory perception not only become free in the other sphere, but also prove creative within that sphere. They shape the matrix substance for the representations through which the spiritual world reveals itself. It would not accomplish much, however, to remain at a standstill with only economies such as those just indicated. For greater results, even more is needed. The soul must be provided with much greater treasure of power to create feeling than is possible in only this way. For instance, as a test, we must expose ourselves to certain outer impressions and then wholly deny ourselves the feelings that typically result. We must, for example, face an event that typically excites the soul, while absolutely and totally forbidding ourselves such excitation. This can be accomplished either by actually confronting the experience or by imaginatively conjuring it. The imaginative method is even better for a truly fruitful esoteric training. As a student, when one is initiated into imagination, either before one's preparation for inspiration or simultaneously with it, one should actually be in a position to place an occurrence imaginatively before the soul with the same force as if it were in fact taking place. If therefore in the course of long inner work we repeatedly subject ourselves to things and events, yet deny ourselves the corresponding normal feelings, we create a fertile ground for inspiration in the soul. Incidentally, it should be noted here that those who describe such training for inspiration can fully appreciate possible arguments against such a description from the perspective of contemporary culture. Arguments can be made, but people can also smile proudly and say, quote, "Inspiration cannot be taught pedantically. It is a natural gift of genius." Close quote. But then, from the perspective of modern culture, it seems almost comical to speak of a process that cannot be explained, yet modern culture itself is unaware of how little it can think through to the end by its own thought processes. Those who expect a devotee of this culture to believe that a more highly developed animal did not slowly evolve but suddenly appeared would quickly be told that a cultured person in the modern sense could not believe in such a miracle. Such a belief would be considered superstitious. Now, in the sphere of soul life, those with such a modern education are themselves simply victims of crass superstition in the style of their own opinions. By the same token, such people will not recognize that a more fully developed soul must also have evolved and could not have sprung into existence suddenly as a gift of nature. Of course, externally, many geniuses seem to have been born suddenly, in quotes, out of nothing, in some mysterious way, though it appears as such only for materialistic superstition. Spiritual scientists know that the assessment of genius in relation to a human life born to this condition, as if out of nothing, is simply the result of that individual's preparation for inspiration during an earlier life on earth. In a theoretical sphere, materialistic superstition is bad, but it is even worse in a practical sphere such as this. Because it assumes that genius in the future must always fall from heaven, it does not bother about the esoteric nonsense or fantastic mysticism that speaks of preparation for inspiration. Thus, the superstition of the materialists retards the true progress of humankind. It does not ensure that latent faculties are developed in human beings. In reality, it is precisely those who call themselves progressives and free thinkers who are frequently the enemies of actual progress. As noted, however, this is only a casual remark, but necessary owing to the relationship between esoteric science and present-day culture. As indicated, the soul powers stored up through the self-denial of normal feelings in our inner being as esoteric students become the riches that will undoubtedly be transformed into inspirations, even if nothing else came to their aid. Moreover, as esoteric students, we would experience how true thought images arise in the soul, representing experiences in higher realities. Progress would begin with the simplest experiences of suprasensory events and gradually become more complicated. Let me read that again. Progress would begin with the simplest experiences of suprasensory events, and gradually more complicated, higher ones arise if we continue to live inwardly according to the directions suggested. Indeed, such esoteric training today would be entirely impractical and is never practiced where such work is taken seriously. If students wish to develop, quote, out of themselves, quote, close quote, all that inspiration can offer, they could undoubtedly spin out of themselves all that has been described here. For example, matters of human nature, human life after death, the evolution of humanity and the planets, and so on. However, such students would need an immeasurably long time to do so. It would be as though we developed the whole discipline of geometry out of ourselves, with no consideration of what has already been achieved in this area. Certainly, in theory, it is fully possible, but to carry it out in fact would be foolish. Nor is this the procedure in esoteric science. Rather, a teacher passes on teachings that have been acquired for humanity by inspired predecessors. Such a tradition must, for the present, provide the basis for individual inspiration. What is offered today in literature and lectures from the realm of esoteric science absolutely can provide such a basis for inspiration. There are, for example, teachings about the various component parts of the human being, parenthesis, physical body, ether body, astral body, and so forth, close parenthesis. Knowledge of life after death, pending a new incarnation. And everything that has been printed in the book titled Cosmic Memory. In other words, it must be grasped at all points that inspiration is needed for discovering and personally experiencing the higher truths, but not for understanding them. What cosmic memory communicates cannot initially be discovered without inspiration. Once communicated, however, it can be understood through wholly ordinary logical judgment. No one should argue that what is said there cannot be grasped logically without inspiration. They are found inconceivable, not through a lack of inspiration, but because they are not given sufficient reflective consideration. When such communicated truths are received, they awaken inspiration in the soul through their own strength. If participating in such inspiration is desired, however, we must make an effort to receive such knowledge in a way that is not ordinary and nonchalant. Rather, we must open ourselves to be moved by the increase of ideas into every possible feeling experience. Why would this not be possible? Can feeling remain dull when overpowering cosmic events pass before the spirit's gaze? The way that the earth developed from moon, sun, and Saturn, or the way that knowledge of the human ether and astral bodies, and so on, penetrates the infinite depths of human nature? We might possibly say, how unfortunate for those who are able to remain unmoved when contemplating such forms of thought. If they did not regard them in a dull way, but lived through all the waves of tension and release of feeling that they engender, climax and crisis, progress and setback, catastrophe and dispersion, then indeed the mother substance would be prepared in them for inspiration itself. Certainly the necessary feeling life, in the face of such communications from a higher world, can be developed only through exercises like those indicated here. Those who turn all their feeling forces toward the outer world of sensory perception will see descriptions from a higher world as arid concepts, as gray theory. They will never be able to grasp why another finds the communications of esoteric science heartwarming, while their own heart remains cold to them. They may even say, but this is only for the intellect. This is intellectual. I would like something for my welfare. But they do not admit it is their own fault that their hearts remain cold. Many still undervalue the power of what lies hidden in these communications from a higher world. And in this connection they overvalue all kinds of other exercises and procedures. Quote, what good is it to me, they say, to learn from others what the higher worlds look like? I want to see them for myself." Close quote. Such persons mostly lack the patience to concentrate over and over again upon such descriptions from higher worlds. If they would do so, they would see what kindling force these mere stories have, and how one's own inspiration is stimulated by hearing an account of the inspirations of others. Certainly other exercises must supplement mere learning if students wish to make rapid progress in the experience of the higher worlds. But no one should underestimate the great significance of learning. In any case, no hope can be given that we will make rapid conquests in the higher worlds through any exercises whatever, unless we also set out to ponder incessantly upon the communications, purely narrative, that have been given from a competent source about the events and beings of the higher worlds. Now that such communications are actually being presented in literature and in lectures and so forth, and the first indications are also being given for the exercises leading to knowledge of higher worlds, parenthesis, as for example indications presented in title How to Know Higher Worlds, close parenthesis, it has now become possible to learn something of what was formerly communicated only in strictly guarded esoteric schools. As frequently mentioned, owing to the special conditions of our time, these things are necessarily published. But on the other hand, it must be continually emphasized that, while it has become easier to acquire esoteric knowledge, we should not yet completely dispense with the sure guidance of an experienced esoteric teacher. Cognition through inspiration leads us to the experience of processes in the invisible worlds, as for instance the evolution of humanity and the earth and its planetary embodiments. When we consider not only processes in these higher worlds, but also beings, then intuition must enter as a mode of cognition. What occurs through such beings is discerned through imagination in pictures, and in laws and relationships through inspiration, but to come face to face with the beings themselves, intuition is needed. We will explain later how inspiration becomes articulate in the world of imagination, how inspiration permeates imagination as spiritual music, and thus becomes the means of expression for the beings who are to be known through intuition. Then intuition itself will also be dealt with. Here we will merely point out that what is designated intuition in esoteric science has nothing to do with the application of the word intuition in current popular use. Such use of the word refers to a more or less uncertain notion, in contrast to clear cognition arrived at logically through intellect or reason. In esoteric science, intuition is not vague and uncertain, but a lofty mode of cognition, full of the most luminous clarity and the most unquestionable certainty. The end of essay number 3. This is a reading of a collection of essays by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Stages of Higher Knowledge. It's 4 essays. This is the last essay, essay 4, entitled Inspiration and Intuition. Just as imagination may be called a spiritual seeing, so may inspiration be called a spiritual hearing. Of course, it must be quite clear that the word hearing means here a perception even further removed from sensory hearing in the physical world than sight in the imaginative, in parentheses, astral world is removed from seeing with the physical eyes. It can be said of the imaginative reality's light and color phenomena that the radiant surfaces and colors of sensory objects are as though lifted and released from those objects to float free in space. But this gives only an approximate idea, for space in the imaginative world is in no way like it is in the physical. Those who believe they see before themselves imaginative color pictures, when they are seeing free-floating colored particles in ordinary space, are mistaken. However, the formation of such color representations is a means toward the life of imagination. Those who attempt to place a flower before the mind's eye and then separate everything that does not represent color from that picture, so that an image of the colored surface is separate from the flower and suspended before the soul, can arrive gradually at an imagination through such exercises. This picture itself is not actually an imagination, but more or less a preliminary fantasy suggestion. Imagination, an actual astral experience, exists first when not only the color is wholly lifted apart from the sensory impression, but also when three-dimensional space has fully lost itself. That this is the case can be confirmed only by a certain feeling, which is described by saying that one no longer feels oneself outside but inside the colored picture, and has the consciousness of partaking of its coming into being. If this feeling is not there, if we remain before the thing as before a sense-bound color picture, then we are dealing not yet with real imagination, but with something fanciful. It should not be said that such fantasy pictures are wholly worthless, however. They can actually be etheric reflections, like shadows, of real astral facts. As such, they have their own value in esoteric scientific training. They can form a bridge to true astral imaginative experiences. A certain danger lurks in the observation only when, as observers, we do not fully apply our sound human judgment at this frontier between the sensory and the suprasensory. It should not be expected that an unfailing test can be given at this frontier, whereby we can differentiate illusion, hallucination, and the fantastic from reality. Such a general rule would surely be comfortable, but comfort is a word that esoteric students should strike from their vocabulary. It can be said only that those who would acquire clarity of discernment in this sphere must already be intent upon it in the ordinary life of the physical world. Those who are not careful in ordinary life to think sharply and clearly will fall a victim to all sorts of illusions on their ascent to higher worlds. Just consider how many snares of everyday life beset sound judgment. How often people do not see clearly what exists, but rather what they desire. In how many cases do people believe something not because they have discerned it, but because it is more acceptable to one's belief? Consider the errors that arise because we do not get to the bottom of something, but form a hasty judgment. All these reasons for deception in ordinary life might be multiplied infinitely. Biased feelings, passion, and so forth play many tricks on sound judgment. If such errors of judgment in ordinary life are disturbing and often disastrous, they become the greatest conceivable danger to the well-being of suprasensory experience. Beyond advice to do everything possible for one's healthy power of discernment and for sound, independent judgment, no general rule can be given to students for guidance in the higher worlds. Once observers in higher worlds realize the true nature of imagination, they are quickly convinced that the images of the astral world are not mere pictures, but manifestations of spiritual beings. They come to realize that such imaginative pictures relate to spirit or soul beings, just as sensory colors relate to sensory things or beings. Such observers will, of course, have yet much to learn. They must learn to discriminate between color formations that are opaque and those that are quite transparent and inwardly clear and radiant. Indeed, they will perceive formations that continually seem to be producing their colored light anew from within, and thus are not only fully illuminated and transparent, but also radiate light from within. They will link the opaque formations to lower beings, the clear, luminous ones to intermediate entities. The inwardly radiant ones will be for them manifestations of higher spiritual beings. If we would arrive at the truth about the imaginative world, we must not form too narrow a concept of spiritual sight. In that world there are not mere light and color perceptions comparable to the sight experiences of the physical world, but also impressions of heat and cold, of taste and smell, and still other experiences of the imaginative, in quotes, senses, for which the physical world offers no likeness. In the imaginative astral world, impressions of heat and cold are revelations of will and intention on the part of soul and spirit beings. Whether such a being aims at good or evil comes to light in a certain effect of heat or cold. Astral beings can also be tasted or smelled. However, what constitutes the physical element of tone and sound in the actual sense is almost wholly lacking in the imaginative world. In this connection, absolute stillness prevails there. Rather, for the progressing spiritual observer, something quite different is offered, comparable to tone and sound, to music and speech in the sensory world. This higher element steps in when every tone and sound from the outer physical world is wholly hushed. Indeed, when even the faintest inner soul echo from this sphere of the outer world is silenced. Then there occurs for the observer what may be called an understanding of the significance of the imaginative experiences. If we were to compare what is now experienced with something in the physical world, we could come only close to explaining the matter by referring to something that does not exist at all in that world. Suppose it were possible to perceive the thoughts and feelings of another person without hearing any words with the physical ear. Such a perception might be comparable to a direct comprehension of the imaginative element called hearing in the spiritual sense. What, in quotes, speaks are the color and light impressions. In lighting up and dimming down, in the color metamorphosis of images, and are revealed harmonies and discords that unveil the feelings, representations, and thought life of soul and spirit beings. Just as tone becomes speech in physical human beings, when thought is imprinted in it, so do harmonies and discords of the spirit world grow into manifestations that are definite thought entities. To this end, darkness must fall upon that world if thought is to be revealed in its immediacy. The experience is this: bright color tones, red, yellow, and orange, are seen to fade away, and it is perceived how the higher world darkens through green to blue and violet. At the same time, a waxing of inner will energy is experienced, full spatial and temporal freedom is experienced, and there is a feeling of being in motion. Certain linear forms and shapes are experienced. These are not experienced as though seen to be drawn before one in any spatial expanse, but rather as though in continuous movement every single curve, every form, was followed by the I capital. In fact, the I is felt as both the artist and the drawing material. Every linear direction, every shift in position, is at the same time an experience of the I. The I, stirred to motion, is recognized as connected with the world's creative forces. The laws of the world are no longer something that the eye perceives outwardly, but a truly miraculous fabric that it is helping to weave. Esoteric science designs all kinds of symbolic drawings and pictures. When these really correspond to fact and are not mere invented figures, they are based on the observer's experiences in higher worlds, which are to be viewed as described. Thus the world of inspiration is placed within the imaginative world. When the imaginations begin to unveil their meanings in silent speech to the observer, the world of inspiration arises within the imaginative world. Physical reality is a manifestation of the world that the spiritual observer penetrates in this way. The physical world, accessible to the senses and to the sensory-bound intellect, is merely the outer surface. For example, a plant seen with physical senses and physical intellect is not the whole being of that plant. One who knows only this physical plant resembles a being who might be able to perceive a person's fingernail, while perception of the whole person is not available. But the structure and being of the fingernail can be understood only when explained by the whole nature of the person. Thus, in fact, the plant is comprehensible only when we know what pertains to it, just as the whole human nature relates to a person's fingernail. But what is related to the plant cannot be found in the physical world. The plant is related to something fundamental that can be unveiled by only imagination in the astral world, and further to something that will be revealed only through inspiration in the spirit world. Thus a plant as a physical organism is the revelation of a being comprehensible by imagination and inspiration. From this it is clear how a path opens up for the observer of higher worlds that has its origin in the physical world. Specifically, we can begin with the physical world and from its manifestations rise to the higher beings sustaining them. If we begin with the animal kingdom, we can rise by this means into the imaginative world. If we begin with the plant world, spirit observation will lead us through imagination to the world of inspiration. If our path is taken in the realities of imagination and inspiration, we soon find beings and truths never revealed in the physical world. We must not therefore think that in this way we come to know only beings of the higher worlds that have physical manifestations. Those who have entered the imaginative world come to know a multitude of beings and events, realities of which those who see only the physical have no inkling. To be sure, there is another way. It does not begin with the physical world. It makes us clairvoyant directly in the higher regions of existence. For many, this method might have more power of attraction than the previous one indicated. But for our life conditions, only an ascent from the physical world should be chosen. It requires self-renunciation of the observer, however, if one is to begin by examining the surrounding physical world to accumulate knowledge and especially experience. In any case, this is the method best suited to our present-day cultural conditions. The other method presupposes a prior acquisition of soul qualities that are very difficult to attain under modern conditions of life. Although such soul qualities have been sharply and clearly stressed repeatedly in past writings, most people still have no idea, or at most an inadequate one, of the degree to which these qualities, for example selflessness and devoted love, must be acquired for attainment of the higher worlds, without starting from the firm ground of the physical. If anyone were to be awakened to the higher worlds without the requisite degree of the corresponding soul qualities, the result would be unimaginable misery. Now we must not believe, however, that the soul qualities just described can be eliminated by those who start with the physical world and its experiences. To believe this would also be an error, having serious consequences. But such a start allows for the gradual acquisition of these qualities in the measure and above all the form that is possible given the conditions of our present life. Another thing comes into consideration in this regard. If we begin with the physical world as indicated, a living connection is retained with this physical world in spite of the ascent into higher worlds. A full understanding continues for all that happens in it, as well as the full energy to work in it. Indeed, this understanding and energy increase in a most helpful way, precisely through knowledge of the higher worlds. In every area of life, even in what seems most ordinarily practical, a knower of the higher worlds will work better and more usefully than one who does not know, provided one has preserved a living connection with physical reality. But those who awake in the higher spheres of existence, without starting from the physical world, are too readily estranged from life. They become hermits, confronting others without understanding or sympathy. Indeed, some people of incomplete development in this sense, not of course those with perfect development, even look down with a certain disdain at experiences of the physical world, with feelings of superiority and so on. Instead of heightened sympathy toward the world, such people become spiritually hardened and self-seeking. Truly, such temptation is not slight, and those striving for ascent into the higher realities would do well to pay attention to it. From inspiration, the spiritual observer may rise to intuition. In terms of esoteric science, this word denotes in many ways the exact opposite of the way it is often used in ordinary life. In the ordinary sense, intuition denotes a notion dimly felt to be true, but one that nonetheless lacks a clear conceptual definition. We see in that meaning a preliminary step toward knowing, not knowing itself. An idea of this nature may, according to that definition, illuminate a great truth like a flash of lightning, but it can initially have value as knowledge when based on conceptual judgment. Sometimes also intuition designates something in quotes felt as truth, of which one is fully convinced, but which one will not weigh down with intellectual judgment. People who become acquainted with spiritual scientific knowledge often say, quote, "That was always clear to me, intuitively," close quote. All this must be put aside completely if the term intuition is to maintain its true significance as intended here. In this application, intuition is not a mode of cognition that lags in clarity behind intellectual knowledge, but one that far surpasses it. With inspiration, the experiences of the higher worlds speak their meaning. The observer lives in the qualities and actions of the beings of these higher worlds. If, as described, we follow the linear shape of a figure with our eye capital, we know that we are not within the being itself, but within its qualities and functions. In imaginative cognition, we actually experience a feeling of not remaining outside, but of being inside the color images. But we know with equal clarity that those color images are not independent beings themselves, but qualities of such beings. With inspiration, we are conscious of becoming one with the activities of such beings, or the manifestations of their will. In intuition, we merge, for the first time, ourself into that of self-contained beings. This cannot happen in the right way unless the emergence takes place not by the effacement, but by completely maintaining our own being. Any loss of oneself in another being is harmful. Therefore, only the I, highly fortified within itself, can plunge into another being without damage. We grasp something intuitively only when the feeling has arisen within which a being is expressing itself, and whose nature and inner content are as one's own I. If we examine a stone with our outer senses and try to understand its peculiarities with the intellect and through common scientific resources, we learn about only the outer aspect of that stone. As spiritual observers, we proceed to imaginative and inspired knowledge. By dwelling within inspiration, we can reach an additional feeling, which may be characterized as follows. Suppose you observe a man on the street. First, he makes a fleeting impression upon you as the observer. Later, you become better acquainted with him, and a moment arrives when you become friends, so that soul opens to soul. When the veils of the soul fall in this way, and one I confronts the other, such an experience is comparable to the experience of a spiritual observer when a stone appears at first as only an outer manifestation, and advances to something related to the whole stone, as a fingernail to a whole human body. It lives itself out as an I, like one's own I. This kind of knowing, which leads into the innermost nature of beings, is attained for us first in intuition. In the discussion of inspiration was mentioned the transformation that the spiritual observer's inner soul constitution must undergo in order to arrive at this mode of cognition. In this connection it has been said, for example, that a false conclusion must extend its effects not only to the intellect, but also to the sensory nature, that it must cause grief and pain, and that the observer must systematically cultivate such an inner experience. Of course, as long as such pain springs from the sympathies and antipathies of the I and from biased attitudes, preparation for inspiration cannot be considered sufficient. Such involvement of the soul is far removed from the inner sympathy that the I must feel for the pure truth, as truth, if it would arrive at the stated goal. It cannot be overemphasized that every kind of overriding interest in ordinary life, such as pleasure and pain in relation to truth and error, must be silenced first, and then a wholly different kind of interest, with no self-seeking, must enter before anything can be done toward cognition through inspiration. This one quality of the inner soul life is, however, only one means of preparation for inspiration. There are unlimited others that must be added to it. As spiritual observers refine themselves more in relation to what has already served for inspiration, they will be better equipped to approach intuition. That's the end of essay number 4 and the end of the book, The Stages of Higher Knowledge, by Rudolf Steiner.